Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sefer Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Pinchas Werner, who is the mechaber of the Sefer Keitzad Seder Mishna, al mivnei Mishnah v'derech limuda Baal Peh. So on the structure of the Mishnah and the way to learn it, Baal Peh. And we will be talking about the Sefer. So thank you, Pinchas, for joining me.
Thank you, Reb Nachi. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, I was born and raised in the Washington, D.C. area. I became observant as a young adult, and I ended up learning in a yeshiva in Monsey for several years. As a little bit more background, I had spent some time before that in Israel, working in Israel, living amongst Israelis, and I had studied Hebrew, and I had some Hebrew language skills, so that really helped me a lot when I first went into yeshiva. That wasn't an obstacle to me. Obviously, modern Hebrew is not the same as the Hebrew of the Mishnah, of Rashi, of the Gemara, with obviously a lot of Aramaic, but it certainly is better than English in that regard. So I was in the yeshiva in Monsey for a number of years, and then after I got married, I came down to Silver Spring and learned in Kollel by Rav Aaron Lopiansky for a couple of years. And then as my family grew, Li'ayin Hara, and my financial options dwindled, I decided to go to law school to try and provide support for my family. And I was able to get a job at the federal government, where I've been working as an attorney for the last 13 years. Now, during that time, I've also had the privilege of giving a Gemara shir a couple nights a week for members of the community as part of the Dirshu program.
Okay, very interesting. So now we have this Sefer, which is, like I said, it's on the structure of the Mishnah, and we'll get more into how to learn about that, which is an interesting topic. How did you get attracted, I guess, drawn to the Mishnah, and especially to such a topic that you ended up writing a Sefer on this?
So that's a good question. There are really two parts to the response there. There's sort of the background part, and then there's the more specific part. So as the background part, when I first was learning in yeshiva, I had a shir on Mishnayos, and I remember very well the first year that the Rebbe was teaching the first Mishnah in the 10th parak of Psachim, and the Mishnah says, Arvei Psachim, Samuch LaMincha, right on Erev Pesach, near Mincha, Lo yochal Adam ad shetechshach, that a person shouldn't eat until it gets dark. And the Rebbe went through just about each one of those phrases, each one of those words. Samuch, what does that mean? He showed how each word was ambiguous. What does Samuch mean? Mincha, he explained how there were two different minchas, Mincha Gedola, Mincha Katana. And what does that mean? Lo yochal, how do we understand that? Does it really mean you can't eat anything? Ad shetechshach, what does that mean? And he went through and he showed the ambiguity of each word. And he explained how we could have hints to understand how to clarify what those words meant. And for me, it was fascinating how so much information, so much ambiguity, and so much subtlety, and so much information was packed into so few words. I'd never really seen anything like it before, and I was kind of floored. I was blown away, and it was almost love at first sight with Mishnah. And so they had shirim there in Mishnayos, and I got very into it. So I started, Sedarim. I had Sedarim that were dafka learning Mishnayos. And so that was sort of the background, that I had this real cheshek for Mishnayos. And then when I came down here to Silver Spring, there was a whole chevra of people in the yeshiva by Rav Aaron who were also very into Mishnayos. I felt right at home. And they were all very into Mishnayos. So we had different types of Seder of Limuni, but it was basically what I would call a standard type of Limud. We go through the Mishnah, you'd have the Rav, you'd have the Tosos Yontos, some people would use Kahati, some people would use the Sefer Yisrael. But that was sort of the background. Now, the specifics of memorizing Mishnayos, which is the subject of the Sefer we're talking about. So that actually is an interesting story. It goes back about a little over 10 years ago. I had 3 young children, and we were going for a car ride on a Sunday afternoon in the summertime. And we were driving to some park in the area. And my wife was reading me an article that she had read, or she was telling me about an article she had read in Hamodia magazine. And it was about a school bus driver in Eretz Yisrael who was making a siyum on Shas Mishnayos with the student on the bus. So she told me the story. And, she knew I was into Mishnayos. And I remember hearing that story, and I thought to myself, how does that make any sense? Like, how did he do that? Like, what do you mean? He's a bus driver, and he made a siyum on Shas with his students in the bus. So I thought to myself, the only way he could do that as if he was memorizing Mishnayos. He was memorizing them and then teaching them to the students as he was taking them to school. Now, I've had a long time to think about that story over time, and given driving norms in Israel, I'm not sure that was a correct deduction, but nonetheless, at that time, I said to myself, this bus driver must have been memorizing Mishnayos. And so, as a very idealistic young father that I was back then, I said, I have my young kids. I had 3 boys at the time, Blia and Hara, and they're strapped in the car. I can get them to learn some Torah right now. Perfect. So I said, I'm going to try and memorize Mishnahs, and I'll teach my kids whenever, sometimes when we're going on a long car trip, maybe teach them a Mishnah. So I don't suggest doing that. Don't try that at home, because that lasted probably about, I think, half a day. Obviously, my kids were not into it, but I went through the exercise of actually memorizing Mishnah. I started with the first Mishnah in Brachos, and I memorized it. And for me, it really gave me a tremendous simcha. It gave me a geschmack. So I memorized the first Mishnah, and then I said, I really enjoyed it. So I did the second one, and I enjoyed that too. And I said, hey, let's see how much I can do. And I started testing myself and just seeing how far I could go. And then, a couple of days turned into a week, and then a month, and then a year, and then here we are, many years later.
Okay, so like I said, really interesting story. And then so now somehow from that story, this turned into a Sefer. So what's the Sefer about? I mentioned what it's about. I said it's talking about Mishnah, Baal Peh, but give before we go a little bit more, into each part. But what, as an overview, what exactly is the Sefer about?
So I guess in broad strokes, the Sefer starts from the premise that the Mishnah is Torah Baal Peh. Obviously, it's not the only thing that's Torah Baal Peh, but it is a very ikar part of Torah Baal Peh. And that, Torah Baal Peh means that it was Torah that was memorized, that it wasn't to be written down, it was to be memorized. And that it was memorized in the times of Chazal. It was meant to be said by memory. And that therefore Chazal structured it in a way that would facilitate memorization. So it suggests different methods that Chazal used in the terms of the way they structure the Mishnayos to facilitate memorization. Then it offers a method for memorizing Mishnayos and retaining them long-term based on different Chazals. And it also offers some sort of hashkafa, chizik for this derech halimud.
Right. Now, I just want to point out, you do make reference in the beginning to when was the Mishnah written and that, but that's not something, you're not really getting involved with that whole thing.
That's correct. I mean, there is, I just point out, there's amongst the Ikar Rishonim, it seems that, Rashi seems to say quite clearly that the Mishnah was not written down. Well, let me take a step back. Obviously, the Mishnah eventually was written down because we have it. And so it's written down at some point in time. Rashi seems to say, Bava Metzia, other places, that the Mishnah was not written down in the times of Chazal, in the times of Rabbeinu HaKadosh. It wasn't actually written down at that time. Rabbeinu HaKadosh was Masader the Mishnah, but he didn't actually write it down. The Rambam, in his Akdama to the Yad, he says that Rabbeinu HaKadosh was Mechaber Sefer HaMishnah. So that strongly suggests that the Rambam understands that in the times of Rabbeinu HaKadosh, it was written down. So I do point out, though, that machlokus, and there's there is a lot of discussion amongst modern scholars about when exactly the Mishnah was written down, but that's not something I focus on, because regardless of when the Mishnah actually was written down, at its source, it was Torah Baal Peh, meaning it was supposed to be said Baal Peh. It was supposed to be said by heart, and therefore I'm presenting that it was structured in a fashion to facilitate that.
So that's where we should really go next. And that is what you start off in the beginning. Before the structuring part, you say, it was written. This is the first part in the beginning of the Sefer. It was, not written. It was composed or organized to be, recited by heart, to be known by memory, Baal Peh. So you discuss this, but what are your proofs? You discuss this aspect of the Mishnah.
So there are a number of sources that explain that the Mishnah is not supposed to be written down. I mean, you have one source there's a Midrash Rabbah in Shmos Rabbah, where the Midrash relates based on the pasuk Sov l'cha es hadibrim ha'eleh, write down these words. It relates when Hashem revealed himself on Har Sinai to teach Torah to Klal Yisrael. It says that he taught Torah to Moshe, Keitzad Seder, Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud, and Agadata. And he said, go teach it. He said to Moshe Rabbeinu, go teach it to Klal Yisrael. And Moshe Rabbeinu said, I'm going to write it for them. And Hashem said, I don't want you to write it all down. You can write down the Torah, the Mikra, the Torah Shebeksav, but not the Torah Baal Peh, because Hashem understood that the Umos HaOlam would overcome Klal Yisrael and be Bezuya ben Umos. And so Hashem says there in the Midrash that Moshe Rabbeinu was not permitted to write down the Mishnah amongst the other Torah Baal Peh. So that's one source. You have another source of Gemara in Gittin, where again it's bringing that same pasuk of Ksov Lecha Sedurim Ha'eleh, and it asks on another pasuk which says Ki Al Pi Hadurim Ha'eleh, Hashem is Koros the Bris. So how does that work? On the one hand, it's saying that we should write down Hashem's words, and the other hand, it says Al Pi, right, which suggests that it's something that's said as opposed to written. And so the Chazal reconcile that by saying Devarim Shebeksav, that things that are written down, the Mikra, you're not permitted to say them by heart, and Devarim Shel Baal Peh, and those things that are Baal Peh, which are oral, you can't say them from being written down. So those are two Iker sources that indicate that the Mishnah, which is part of Torah Baal Peh, it's listed as the first thing of the first part of the Torah Baal Peh, is not meant to be written down. So those are two Iker sources.
So after you point that out, now you go and you, as you already mentioned or alluded to, that the Chazal went and they structured, the Mishnah was structured in a certain way to fulfill this purpose. So what exactly is that? Just expand a little bit, or more than a little bit, on that, exactly what you mean by that.
Well, I guess before we get to that point, Reb Nachi, if we could just go back, I think there's a little bit more I'd like to talk about in terms of the Mishnah not being written down at that time. There are a number of Chazals. This is something I do discuss in the Sefer. There are a number of places in Chazal where they make a distinction between the words they use talking about Mikra versus the words they use to talk about Mishnah or other Torah Baal Peh. So the point I'm trying to bring out is that you have a number of Chazals where when it's referring to Mikra, something that's written, it uses the word likros, kore. Whereas when it's talking about Mishnah or Torah Baal Peh, it uses a different word of shone. And that also indicates how there's a difference between Torah B'Ksav, the Mikra, and Torah Baal Peh, the Mishnah and the Gemara. One Iker source there would be the Gemara in the 5th parak of Eruvin, which talks about Keitzad Seder Mishna. That's where the title for the Sefer was taken. It's an Agadata, it's a Chazal there in the 5th parak of Eruvin, where it says Keitzad Seder Mishna. How was the Mishnah organized? And it says that Moshe learned it from the Pia Gevura. He learned it from the Pia Gevura. And then it says Aaron came in, and it says that it said Shana lo Moshe Pirko. Moshe was shone to Aaron his parak. And then it says that Aaron's sons came in, and then he was shone to them. And then the Zakanim came in, and Moshe was shone to them. And it constantly uses this word shone. And at the end of that Chazal says Rabbi Eliezer learns from here, because each one sort of heard it 4 times. It says, Mikan Amar Rabbi Eliezer, Chayav Adam Lishnos the Talmido Arba Pamim. A person has to be shone to his Talmud 4 times. And that's obviously talking about the Mishnah, because it says Keitzad Seder Mishna. So it's talking about Torah Baal Peh. And Chazal used that word of shone. There's another interesting Chazal in Megillah where you can see this tension between likros versus lishnos. There the Gemara says, Chayav Adam likros is a Megillah. Laila, a person has to be kore the Megillah at night. V'lishnosa b'yom. It uses again that same shorish shone, lishnosa b'yom, and then it's based on a pasuk in Tehillim. And the Gemara goes on to say that the Talmidim who heard this, they understood that to mean that they should read the text of the Megillah at nighttime, and then they should go over the Mishnayos of it in the daytime. And Rashi there explains that the Bnei Yeshiva, when they heard it in this Lashon of Lishnos in Lashon HaKodesh, they thought it means Lashon Shone Mishnah, right? So there's a difference between being Koreh, something that's written, and being Shone, something that's the Mishnah. And so discussing that's Baal Peh. There's also a very famous Rashi in the beginning of Parshas Mishpatim. We'll get there soon enough, God willing. And that's a Mechilta that he's bringing. And it talks about how Hashem says to Moshe, right? Ela hamishpatim asher tasim lefneihem. These are the mishpatim that you should put in front of Klal Yisrael. And so Hashem says, the Mechilta relates, Hashem says to Moshe, don't think she'eshne lehem haperek, that I will be eshne, the perek, 2 or 3 times, ashetehe sedura befihem kemishnasa, until it's sedura befihem, it's organized in their mouths, kemishnasa, as its Mishnah. So there again, you see this concept of being the shone related to the Mishnah and being something that is said. There are other places where Chazal point this out. There's another Gemara in Brachos, which talks about what certain people who have certain levels of Tuma, what they can learn. And then there too, in that Gemara, in that Chazal, when it talks about Mikra, it uses the word Koreh. And then when it talks about Mishnah, it says Shone. And it says that a person can be Shone beregilios. Rabbi Yossi's Shita there says. And what are these Shone regilios? Rashi there explains, these are the Mishnayos that are Seduros Befiv, that he can be Motzian Bepiv B'merutza. He can say them very quickly. So we see this concept of Mishnah, something that you could be Shone, something that you could say it over. It's something that you would sort of have by heart. And that would be an oral tradition.
Right, and you go through this actually at the word Mishnah, where the word Mishnah comes from and what the word Mishnah means, and it's similar to Sheni. This second time, right? You discussed this also at length in the first parak.
That's right, about the Mishnah relating to repetition. Being Shone is to repeat something. I'm suggesting that the word Shone, the shorish of Shone, that word, when it's used in relation to Torah Baal Peh, it's referring to repeating over certain words in a certain way to remember them. It's repeating words. It's saying these words. You have a Mishnah in the 4th parak of Tanis, where it says, talking about the Ma'amados there, how Klal Yisrael could participate in the Korban Tamid that was brought twice a day. And the Mishnah there says that any day there's a Hallel, there's no Ma'amad in Shacharis. When there's a Korban Musaf, you wouldn't have it at the times of Ne'ilah. And if there's a Korban Eitzim, you would not have this Ma'amad at Mincha. That's Divrei Rabbi Akiva. That's Rabbi Akiva's Shita. So the Mishnah there relates that Amar lo Ben Azai says to Rabbi Akiva, Kachaya Rabbi Yeshua Shone. This is how Rabbi Yeshua was Shone. So you have to understand, what does that mean? Shone means. And then the Mishnah says he was Shone, Korban Musaf. It says a Korban Musaf, Ein Bo Ben Mincha. Then there's no Ma'amad in Mincha. Korban Eitzim, if there's a Korban Eitzim, then Ein Bo Ben Ne'ilah. And then the Mishnah relates, Chazar Rabbi Akiva lios Shone ke Ben Azai. Rabbi Akiva was Shone like what Ben Azai said. And I'm suggesting that what that means is the words Rabbi Yeshua said for this halacha of when do you not have a mamad were, quote, Korban Musaf, Ein Bo Mincha, Korban Eitzim, Ein Bo Ne'ilah. And then Rabbi Akiva adopted that lashon when he would say over this halacha. Obviously, he thought about the reasons, and it wasn't just, he heard it, but thought of the svaras. But I'm suggesting that that's what the word shone means.
Okay, so now that we established that that's what the Mishnah, so you discussed how Chazal structured the Mishnah in this way for this purpose. So want to discuss a little bit there what your rayas, your proofs are to that, and what you discuss about over there in the second parak.
Okay, so I guess I should sort of just say at the outset that I obviously I can't say that I know definitively why Rabbeinu Hakadosh or why Chazal structured the Mishnah, why they did. There are many levels, there are many reasons for why Chazal did things the way they did. I mean, there's a Sefer Hon Ashir, which goes through different Kabbalistic reasons for why the Mishnah, in terms of prakim, in terms of different words, in terms of different organizations. So there are many, many levels that Chazal had, and I I can't pretend to say that this is exactly why they did this, and this is the only reason why they did this. But there are sources that that show that Chazal did think about retaining the Mishnah in terms of how it was organized. So you have one Gemara in the first parak of Megillah, where the Gemara is talking about the first Mishnah in the Megillah, and that first Mishnah talks about when in Megillah Nikreis, when is the Megillah read? And it goes through a list of days. It says Megillah Nikreis, the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th, no earlier and no later. And then the Mishnah goes on to say, how is certain cities would read it on the 15th, other cities read it on the 14th, except for the villages, they would read it earlier on the Yom HaKanisa. That's what the Mishnah says there. And then the Mishnah goes on to explain how is this. And so then when the Mishnah explains how it is, it says if the 14th happens to be on a Monday, then the villages would read it on that Monday. If it happens to be on a Tuesday, then the villages would go back to Monday. And it just says the days of the week. It doesn't tell you what the day of the month is. It just tells you what the day of the week is when the 14th falls out on. So the Gemara asks about that. The Gemara says, Maishna Reisha, why is it in the beginning of the Mishnah, the Nakat Sidur the Yarcha, where it mentions the days of the month, the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th, Umaishna Seifa, and then why later in the Mishnah, in that parak, that basically the next, what we see as the next Mishnah, is Nakat Sidur the Yoma. It's only talking about the days of the week, and it's not talking about the days of the month. And the way Rashi explains, and the Gemara ends up by saying, he says, I did the Mitzhachile, since it gets reversed, right? Since it'll get reversed, that's why they stick with the days of the week and then the Mishnah, not the days of the month. And Rashi explains that what would happen is you'd have the days of the week progressing, second day of the week, third day of the fourth day, and at the same time, the days of the month would be going in the other direction, from the 14th to the 13th to the 12th. And Rashi concludes by saying, if that's the way it was done, Toe girsa the girsaso hashone is the Mishnah. The person who is being shone the Mishnah is going to mix up their girsa. They're not going to be able to remember it correctly. They're going to get confused and they're going to lose it. So that's one place where the way Rashi understands the Gemara and the Gemara's question is that the Mishnah was organized in a way to facilitate memorization. There's also a klal that Chazal have. It's in the beginning of Maseches Pesachim, that la'olam yishane adam l'talmido derech lashon katzara, derech katzara. That a person should, a rebbe should say to their talmid, be shone to their talmid derech katzara. And Rashi explains why is that, and he says because a shorter lashon miskayemis girsa shala yoser min aruka, that the girsa, right, whatever it is, whatever is being said over, being taught to the Talmud, he'll retain it better. He'll have a kiyum. Rashi says elsewhere that kiyum means to retain it. It'll have a kiyum, and that's something that's it's logical that if you say less words, it's easier to remember than if you make it very lengthy. So that's a general klal that Chazal have, and the Mishnahs you see, they're very, very, very terse. They're very succinct, and Chazal did that. I'm suggesting Chazal did that in order to facilitate memorization. So those are two sources there. There's also a Tiferes Yisrael in the fourth parak of Maseches Erechim, where he talks about the first Mishnah there, that there's different lashonos in the Mishnah, that there's a question Tosfos was asked actually on the question of why the Mishnah uses certain words. And there the Tiferes Yisrael goes into a discussion he really talks about chasuri mechzer v'hachikatani. Why is it that there are certain parts of the Mishnah that are missing? Why did Chazal have to point that out? Why didn't they put that into the Mishnah? Why are those parts left out? And the Tiferes Yisrael explains that there's a cadence, there's a rhythmic cadence to the Mishnah to facilitate memorization, and that the reason why those parts of the Mishnah are left out is because that's how Chazal structured it in order so that it would have this sort of shira to it, this zimra to it, that would facilitate memorization. So those are three sources that indicate, that support a notion that Chazal structured the Mishnah in a way to facilitate memorization. And on a certain level, a lot of times Chazal ask question on Mishnayos, like, why did it say this? And Chazal will give an answer. I did a Tana Reisha, Tana B'Sefer. Or since it said it in the beginning, it also says it in the end. One example of that would be in the seventh parak of Brachos, where it goes through, who can be part of a zimun, and it lists five different categories. And the fifth category is a shamash achal kazais. And then in the Sefer, it says these are the ones who cannot be part of a zimun. It goes through 5 categories as well. And the fifth category there is shamash achal pachos mikazais, less than a kazais. And so the Gemara asks on that, says, well, why do you have to tell me that you already told me a shamash who ate a kazais can be part of a zimun? Why do you have to tell me that a shamash that ate less cannot be part? It seems Gemara says it's pshita. And then the Gemara answers by saying, I did the Tana Reisha. Since in the Reisha we said shamash achal kazais, Tana Sefer, we say in the Sefer, shamash achal pachos, a shamash that ate less than a kazais. So, there are many places where Chazal do this. And the question is, like, what exactly is that answer? What does that mean to say, since it said it in the beginning, we say it in the end here? Why is that? So I'm suggesting that that's part of, along the lines of what the Tiferes Yisrael is saying, and that there was sort of a balance. There was a structure to the Mishnah that facilitated memorization. Having 5 in the beginning and then 5 in the end that are sort of mirror images of each other. That is easier to remember than if it's 5 in the beginning, 5 components in the beginning, only 4 in the end. That's not gonna flow as smoothly. That's not gonna be as easy to remember.
Okay, and so really the second parak, there's like 7 things that you really go through.
Yes, there are 7 different points. There are 7 different methods that I'm suggesting, and I do point out that these are not exclusively for memorization. That these methods here, it's not the only reason. It's not the only reason why Chazal have these sort of structures in there. And I'm suggesting that there are other ways in which Chazal facilitated memorization. I'm just listing. It's not an exclusive list. I'm just listing 7 of them. So I guess, would you like me to go through some of those?
Yeah, you can go through. Sure.
Okay. So the first one is, again, the names are names that are descriptive names that I put those there. Those aren't things that Chazal talk about. I mentioned that in the Sefer, that these are not, for the most part. Derech, Lashon Ketzara, that is something that Chazal talk about in the beginning of Pesachim and elsewhere. But the other ones, it's not something that Chazal explicitly say, just so you know, we're doing it this way so that you can memorize it. I'm not aware of where Chazal actually said that explicitly. But one example would be what I call bitum nishnim, right? That these are repeat phrases, where you have certain phrases that appear almost without fail throughout Shas in the exact same format. So, like, one obvious example would be cheresh shote v'katan, right? Cheresh shote v'katan. That group of those 3 terms together, they appear in many places in Shas, and they always appear in the exact same order. So, you sort of take it for granted, but why would Chazal necessarily do that? They do it everywhere. And that's just one example. Right? That's another example. There are many, many examples of these sort of phrases that Chazal use that are almost always presented in the exact same order. And so I suggest that is sort of there's a logic behind it. There's a reasoning behind that, and that is to facilitate memorization. Because when you actually try to memorize the Mishnayos, you see that having those repeat phrases being the same, it actually creates this sort of self-reinforcing cycle for somebody's memory. Because when you go over a Mishnah that has a phrase in it, cheresh shote v'katan, and then you go over another Mishnah and it has the exact same phrase in it, it helps in 2 ways. First of all, it reminds you that phrase and how that phrase is said. You're sort of reminding yourself of that phrase. And also, that phrase is going to be easier for you to remember, so that you have less, so to speak, to memorize in the Mishnah, because you just have to plug that phrase in there instead of having to memorize cheresh shote v'katan. You just plug that phrase in, so to speak. And so in that way, they sort of form these building blocks that can form a foundation for the Mishnah that make memorization easier.
So also, I would just mention at the end of the parak, you have like a table, a chart, with colored for the listeners, like with the table with the gray boxes.
Yes. So that was just taking an example. It's the first parak in Tanis, where just trying to show where if you take a parak and you can see how these different methods manifest themselves, how they express themselves in that parak, where you have a lot of repeat phrases there. You have a lot of phrases in that parak that actually appear elsewhere in Shas, in other Masechtas, in Rosh Hashanah, in Brachos, in Yoma. And so you sort of get a sense. I'm trying to highlight how you can see, this is an example where you can see there are different methods that Chazal are using that facilitate memorization. And I guess one last point I want to add is, there is a logical component to this that, if the Mishnah is Torah Baal Peh, which Chazal tell us it is, and if it's not supposed to be written down, which Chazal tell us is the case, then it's logical that it would be organized in a way that would facilitate memorization. That there is a basic logical component to that.
Right, for sure. So the next part, and also I don't know if I mentioned the Sefer is around 130 pages. It's the Zakdama. There's 4 prakim, so four chapters. So we have to really
Four halakim, four
halakim,
yes,
as you call it. So in the third part, you really discuss is a way or some ways that people can actually learn Mishnayos Baal Peh. So why don't you discuss it? How did you come up with those, and what do you discuss?
So thank you, Reb Nachi, for saying a way, because I think there are many ways to memorize Mishnayos. There are many methods. This is a way that has worked for me, and I do think that there are Chazals that support this. I had started to, as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, I had started memorizing Mishnayos before I had come across most of these sources. But as I was memorizing Mishnayos, and I was learning different Gemaras as part of the Dirshu Shir that I was involved in, I came across different Gemaras, and they really struck me in a different way. And I felt they really resonated with me in terms of memorizing Mishnayos. And in particular, when I got to the 5th parak of Eruvin, there's really like a blot there where they discuss the value of learning in a certain way. And the way they describe it there, it really resonated with the memorizing of the Mishnayos that I was involved in at that time. So I guess in terms of the way I present it, there are 4, I guess, take a step back. There's 2 overarching components. There's the first part is actually memorizing the Mishnah. And then the second part is retaining the Mishnah for more than just a day, a week, even a month, retaining it long term. So in terms of actually learning the Mishnah, so there's the first step that I suggest there is to focus just on the girsa of the Mishnah. Now, what that means, I'm going to refer to it as a text because that's how we have it now, but focusing just on the text of the Mishnah. There is a Gemara in Tanis that seems to support this, where it refers to, it's in the first parak, it talks about Reish Lakish, says if you see a Talmud who's, it's very difficult for it to learn, it's because his Mishnah is not the store for him. And then it relates how Reish Lakish would go over a Mishnah 40 times, and then he would go before his Rabbi Yochanan. And Rashi explains there, says that he would go before Rabbi Yochanan Lemigmar Gemara, to learn Gemara. And Rashi elsewhere in Bava Metzia and in Brachos explains that Gemara is Svaras Tamei HaMishnayos. It's the understanding of the Mishnayos. It's the time for the Mishnayos. It's the Svaras behind the Mishnayos. So you have this idea of Reish Lakish going over the Mishnah and then going before Rabbi Yochanan to learn sort of the paras of the Mishnah. So you have there, you see this focusing on just the text first, and then the understanding of what the text means. So that's the first component. That's really sort of the key, because that's a different way to approach Mishnayos. Generally, at least, how I've done it, how other people have done it, that I'm familiar with, is, you start the Mishnah and then you go into the Perushim. You go straight into, the Rav, you go into Tosfos Yontot, whichever parish you're using, you go relatively quickly, you go into that parish. But what I'm presenting here is that that's really a separate limud. There's separate, learning what the Mishnah means is a separate limud from actually memorizing the Mishnah itself. So the first thing is to focus just on the girsa of the Mishnah. And there are, of course, there are some quite long Mishnayos, but many Mishnayos really are not that long. And, I suggest we have more of an ability to remember things than we give ourselves credit for. We can remember our addresses. We can remember phone numbers. It's not as easy to remember phone numbers these days, but we remember addresses. We certainly remember what people say to us, for better and for worse. But we can remember a lot. And so if you look at the Mishnah, many Mishnahs really are not that many words. There's a Mishnah in the third parak of Sukkah that has 7 words in it. That is an exceptionally short Mishnah, but many Mishnahs don't have that many words to it. And if we focus just on that girsa, then you can remember it. So that's the first step, is just to focus on the girsa. But there's a question of how do you actually do that? How do you actually memorize it? And that's where the 5th parak of Eruvin comes in, because there, the 5th parak of Eruvin, and Eruvin brings different chazals about the importance of saying it. You have to actually say it. You can't just read it over with your eyes or think it. You have to actually say it. Right? Chaim hem lemotzehem Baal Peh, that those who actually say it with their mouth, you have to say it out loud. It brings a Maisa there in the 5th parak of Bruria, who bumped into a Talmud who was a Garis Belachisha. He was going over his girsa silently, or at least whispering it, and she kicked him, and she said, Arucha b'kol shmura, that if you put in your whole body into it, then you're gonna have a shimur, you're gonna retain it. If not, you're not gonna retain it. And then it also brings a Maisa of a student of Rabbi Eliezer, says that he was Shone Belachash. He would be Shone again. You have that word Shone Belachash, silently. And after 3 years, he forgot his limud. So you have to say it. You have to say it out loud. And then also based on the Gemara there in Eruvin, you have to enunciate it clearly. You have to say the words clearly. It says there, the Chazal relate that Bnei Yehuda, Daike b'lishonei, they were very medaik in their lashon. And Niskaima Torah Sambiyadan, they retained their Torah. That's Rashi explains. Niskaima Yadan, that they retained it, they remembered it. Whereas Bnei Galil, the people of the Galil, they were not medaik in their lashon. They were not careful with their lashon, and they forgot it. And Chazal, they bring an example of what it means that they weren't careful in the lashon, and it relates a story of somebody who was walking and they said, Amar Laman, Amar Laman. They said this phrase, Amar Laman, Amar Laman, and somebody said, what are you saying? Do you mean that you're looking for a donkey? Are you looking for wine? Are you looking for some wool? Are you looking for an animal to shecht? Like, he wasn't saying it clearly. And so enunciating the words clearly, that helps to remember the girsa. So that's sort of the steps that I present based on Chazal for memorizing the Mishnah. That's sort of the first step, is actually just memorizing the Mishnah. Then there's the retaining part of it. So the retaining part of it, there are a number of Chazals. I mean, there is the Chazal I mentioned in Tanis, where it says Reish Lakish would go over a Mishnah 40 times before he'd go before his rabbi, Rabbi Yochanan. And it says that Rav Ada bar Ahava would go over the Mishnah 24 times before he'd go before his Rav Rava. And so suggest that going over the Girsa 24 or 40 times, that's going to help have retention. Rashi there, if I'm not mistaken, Rashi there in Tanis says they would go over it so that they would have it. In other words, they would have it in their hands, and then they would go before their rabbi. And so, doing it 40 times, 24 times in one day, that's quite a lot. But spreading it out, if you do it over 24 days or 40 days, that's not as much. Because, if you're saying a Mishnah, if you think about it, just saying the Mishnah, depending on the size of the Mishnah and how well a person knows it, but it could take 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, depending on the Mishnah. And so going over it over these days, that's a way that a person can really get it down. And that's sort of, I present that as what I call local chazorah, sort of a cycle of going over them for 24 or 40 days to retain them, to be able to retain them long term. And that long term retention is a separate cycle of Chazara that I call global Chazara. And that's based on a 30-day cycle. And that too is based on different Chazals. There's a Chazal in Ksubis, which talks about Rabbi Chanina Bar Papa, that he was going to pass away. He had Chaykas with the Malach HaMavis. He was Shuzvine, I think it says. And the Malach HaMavis went and appeared to him before he was going to die, and was going to do what Rabbi Chanina Bar Papa wanted. And so Rabbi Chanina Bar Papa asked for 30 days so that he could be choser on his learning. And he says, because it says, Ashrei Misha Balakan, fortunate is the one who comes here, referring to Olam Haba, V'Talmudu biyado, and he has his Talmud in his hand. Other places where Rashi explains having your Talmud in your hand means you remember it. So going over 30 days, that a 30-day cycle would enable somebody to retain things for more of a long-term retention. So that's sort of what I present there.
Okay, so then in the final part, the fourth part of the book, you discuss kind of like a machshava musar kind of thing about why people should learn it by heart.
So, yes, I guess is the question, why did I include that, or where does that come from?
Right, I guess I left it kind of open-ended over there. I guess, yeah, where does that come from? And also, right, why did you decide to include that? It's not, of course, it's relevant to the rest of the Sefer, but like it's a little different than the first three parts.
Well, I guess sort of to answer that question, I think that sort of goes to why I even wrote this Sefer in the first place. I didn't really set out to write a Sefer. When I started learning Mishnayos, it wasn't my goal that I was going to ultimately write a Sefer. I didn't imagine that. It wasn't something that I had ever thought I would do. But over time, as I went through more of Mishnayos and as I went through more of the Gemaras, I had a lot of ideas. I had a lot of ideas that were sort of bubbling up inside of me. And I felt like I had something inside of me. And I originally actually just started to send myself emails every now and then to sort of organize my thoughts, get them down. And then eventually I got to a point where I spoke to a number of my Rebbeim to see, is this legitimate? What am I doing here? Is this an appropriate thing to be doing? And they were very supportive of that. And I really felt like I had something inside of me. And so I originally was going to write down just some thoughts for myself, for my own kids. And I just started writing it. And I didn't think I was going to be writing a Sefer. And I thought it would be maybe 4 pages, 5 pages. I originally started writing in English, but then I realized that it was really about the Lashon of, Lashon Mishnah. It was the Lashon of Chazal. And so I switched over to Hebrew, and it just kept on expanding. There kept on being more thoughts to put down, and eventually it got rather large. And it's not such a big Sefer, but and then I had something. I had a chayfetz, and I brought it to some of my Rebbeim, and I showed it to them, and I asked them. I said, "Is this something valuable? Is this something that would help other people?" And as I was writing it, I was writing almost as much for myself as I was for other people. And for myself, as somebody who's, in the workforce, who's out of yeshiva, it's always been a struggle, something that I've always tried to find opportunities to strengthen my Torah learning, to stay connected to the Torah as much as I can. When you spend most of your day in an office with people who are very different. They're very good people, but some of them are good, some of them are not as good. But there are different types of people, and there's all sorts of influences. And so for me, this Mahalach has given me a real sense of sipuk nefesh in terms of growing in Torah and having sort of a tachbulas, having some sort of a way to try and counteract the very strong influences that are out there and the strong winds that are blowing. And so for, presenting that in the Sefer, I thought was an important idea, because really, I say in the Hakdama that I do think that, anybody who's involved in learning can benefit from this Mahalach. I do emphasize that I'm not at all suggesting that this should be in place of, learning Gemara and Rashi and Tosafos and all the Rishonim and the Achronim. Not at all. But this could actually supplement that type of learning. That it can help a person's learning when they get the Mishnahs down. They can approach a Gemara with a different perspective. They can, it helps them clarify where in the Gemara is where they're quoting a Mishnah. What's the kasha on this Mishnah, on the lashon of the Mishnah, on the order of the Mishnah. But the point is that I do think it could help anybody who's learning, but the ikr, I think it helps those who are not able to sit in learning for extended periods of time. They really don't have so much time for a seder during the day. One of the milas of this derech halimud is that a person can do it wherever they are. In other words, they can be walking down the street and they can say over the Mishnah. They can be waiting at a street corner. They can say the Mishnah. They can be on their way to shul and they can say over the Mishnah, right? They don't have to have the Sefer with them. They don't have to be sitting in a basement. Obviously, the basement is a makom kadosh. It is the ikar place where a person should be learning to the extent that they can. But this enables those who are out in the world to sort of have the Torah with them. They bring the Torah with them wherever they are. And so that chelik and sort of giving the chizuk for that, I felt that was something important to include.
Okay, so finally, I would ask you so who do you envision now the Sefer meant for? Who do you envision picking up? Is it just anyone? Is it someone working dafka? What do you think?
So I do write that I think it could really benefit those who have yeshiva background, but who are no longer able to sit in learning to the same extent and want to continue to grow in their learning. It can give a person a sense. It's not just a sense. They are growing in their limud Torah. So I envision people who are not learning full time anymore, but who want to continue their growth in Torah, buying it. I do think it could help a lot those who are learning in Beis Midrash all day. I do think that it could help them in terms of their clarity in their learning. Obviously younger people tend to have a better memory, so I think it would be easier for them to memorize Mishnah. So I do think it could help younger people, but I think anybody who wants to grow in their limud Torah, I think it could help them.
Okay, so very interesting, and I'll try to include a link in the show's notes for where people can purchase it, and it should be available though in farm stores as well, right?
Well, they have it at Eichler's in Borough Park. Zimmerman Books has it online, and I know other farm stores have it as well here in America, and in Eretz Yisrael they have it as well.
Okay, very interesting. So, with that, thank you very much for joining me to discuss about your Sefer.
Thank you, Reb Nachi. Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, my pleasure.